Welcome to the Westminster Tradition, a podcast with lessons for the public service. My name is Danielle Elston, Managing Director of Good Government Advisory, and joining me today on Ghana land is my fellow recovering public servant, Caroline Crozer-Barlow.
Hello, Danielle.
And we have a very special guest today, Deputy Commissioner of the National Anti-Corruption Commission, Kylie Kilgour. Commissioner, welcome.
Thanks very much, Danielle. And Caroline.
Kylie, you were the delegate responsible for conducting the investigations into the 6 parties referred from the Robodebt Royal Commission back in 2023. It came to you because you weren't even employed by the NACC during the original NACC decision not to investigate. And as someone who has come out of the VPS, the Victorian Public Service, you didn't have any relationship with the 6 referred people. So you conducted a very forensic examination of a range of really specific incidents and found 2 people, Mark Withnell and Serena Wilson, engaged in serious corrupt conduct. We want to hear a bit more about that definition of corrupt conduct because I think being clear on it and everyone understanding it is really helpful. And the things that were and weren't referred to the NACC at the end of the episode. But first up, you wrote a chapter which you popped right at the end of the report where you offered some observations about the principal contributing factors to the serious corrupt conduct you found. Given lots of the coverage focuses on the he said, she said kind of individual components, we really wanted to give you some time to unpack your points on that. So can we start at the end instead of the beginning? Because we're good like that over here at the Westminster Tradition. You concluded that the principal contributing factors for Mark Withnell's corrupt conduct were profound ignorance of social security law, failure to work properly with lawyers, rushed and unreasonable timelines, which fascinate me, and unreasonable pressure from the Deputy Secretary. Can you tell us a bit more about that? I think our listeners will be particularly interested in those factors.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just start off with a bit of an explanation about why that section's there at the very end of the report, because people might not be aware one of our functions is to consider ways to prevent corrupt conduct from occurring, and we also have power to make recommendations to Commonwealth agencies in relation to this. So as part of any investigation we undertake, we will be looking at whether there are observations and or recommendations to make to prevent corrupt conduct from occurring, and that can be at a system, agency or individual level. So in the Operation Myrtleford report, that final chapter is a very short one where I've tried to summarise the underlying contributing factors in relation to both the people I found engaged in serious corrupt conduct in this investigation, because I'm very conscious that a lot of people don't have time to read all 450 pages of the report.
Caroline does, Commissioner. Caroline does.
That's very nice. As my children say, Mum, TLDR.
Yeah.
And I would say this, wouldn't I? But if people really want to understand more about why I make the observations, read at least the evidence chapter and the findings in relation to both Mr. Withnell and Ms. Wilson, because I think they provide you with a lot more detail about what's summarised in that final chapter. But for the purposes of our chat today, I'll just talk now just specifically regarding Mr. Withnell. So absolutely there were those 4 contributing factors that we identified. And you can read in the evidence chapter a lot more about how DHS went about developing the policy proposal in 2014-2015. And what the evidence shows is there was very little legal advice sought by the DHS compliance branch officers as they were working on the proposal, and also a reluctance to listen when a couple of DHS and DSS lawyers did point out there were issues with what was being proposed. And then really, I think, an avoidance of those lawyers, with compliance officers trying to work out for themselves whether it was legal or not, often by selecting sections of the Social Security Act and or the Social Security guidelines, which they thought supported what they were proposing to do with averaging. And I think one of the takeouts, and what I also call one of the 101 for those of us working with legislation that I often have to remind people about, is legislative frameworks are very complex. The Social Security laws are no different to a lot of the public administrative laws that we have to operate or administer, and you can't just pick sections of the Act without reading the whole thing.
Yeah.
Then I also make comment about the rush to get this done for the 2015-2016 budget, and the evidence shows that the proposal was first floated as a very preliminary idea with the then ministers in January 2015, and then it turned into a budget submission by mid-March 2015, which is way too quick for such a complex change and inherently risky. And in this case, the worst outcome was that people actually engaged in corrupt conduct in that process.
Yeah.
And I think in the podcast that you released this week, you've already read out a couple of the passages in the report regarding the conduct of the Deputy Secretary and the impact that had on Mr. Withnell and everyone else who worked with her. And I think they pretty much sum up what was going on there. So I'll just say, while I'm very conscious that that person is deceased and she didn't have an opportunity to give her side of the story, the evidence of all of the witnesses was very consistent and compelling about the impact that that conduct had on the culture in the workplace. And ultimately, I considered it was a contributing factor why a senior DHS public official misled his DSS colleagues.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's unfamiliar to a lot of public servants. So, I mean, you know, I think most people who have worked in 4 or 5 places or have had maybe up to 8 or 9 bosses will have worked near someone who can kind of tip the culture of the whole organisation over. So,
and absolutely, I've had that feedback from a number of people who have read the report, that they felt that they had lived that experience themselves, either with that person and or with other people that they've worked with in the Commonwealth.
And this is the most egregious example of what can happen and like what the fallout and the roll down the hill of that can be. And that's, I suppose, also where that prevention component kicks in for the NACC, which is we need to get to these things well before we are in those 4 risk factors in relation to the culture of the organisations.
Can I scoot us back a little bit? Because one of the things that you point out in here, and it was also found in the APSC findings, and that we really kind of, like Danielle and Alison, were shocked when I reminded them of it in the pod, is this thing about rushed and unreasonable timelines. And like I know, lots of our listeners are in a time of austerity and they're being asked to do more with less. And, you know, there's a lot of kind of sense of we need to be fast, agile, very lean. And so on the one hand, like I feel so acutely the way in which the unreasonable timelines here were an enabling condition of the corrupt conduct. And on the other hand, it's sort of like it feels like an impossibly high bar. Like you're like, oh, we always feel rushed and under-resourced to do something. My sense is that it's something to do with what you said before about the kind of risk profile of the thing, like that this was a big and complex thing to be doing and it was a high-risk activity. Can you just unpack a little bit more what you mean about this idea of kind of that failure to consider the impact on and capacity of staff and work quality is like that is a contributing factor here?
Yeah, and that language is really from the APSC findings. I use slightly different language, and I think also the APSC findings might be about a couple of things that went on during the Robodebt scheme, not just this NPP process. But with respect to the NPP process, I think what the evidence shows is that those sort of rushed and unrealistic timetables are probably applicable to any time people are working on complex change proposals, particularly ones that involve complicated legislative policy and ICT changes, and absolutely ones that are going to affect a very vulnerable cohort of citizens.
Yeah.
And moving from briefing a minister in January, here's an idea we've got, but we haven't really unpacked all the policy and legislation issues with it. And then a minister says, okay, please develop that idea for me a bit more. But that somehow gets interpreted in DHS as that by March, what we have to do is present a fully thought out and costed budget submission. And I note that wasn't actually the instruction that the minister gave, either in the paperwork or in the evidence that I had before me. That was not what the minister actually ever said to anybody. Yeah. And it's just fraught with danger on so many levels. And one of those is that people might act dishonestly, which is what happened in this case.
Yeah. And I love
and absolutely, I think austerity is like, it's a real challenge for all of us in the public service. I've been a public servant for a very long time. What I'd say, based on my own experience as someone who's had to go to ministers and say, I'm sorry, we can't do this thing in the time that you're asking us to do it in. If you want us to do it, what we can do is this, and then we can do this, bigger thing in, chunkier bits that sort of lead to a bigger piece of reform. I think it's really important that public servants remember that you do have a duty to have that ongoing dialogue with your senior managers and with your ministers about if we are in an austerity environment, what are the trade-offs and what are the consequences if we don't pay attention to getting it right? And that includes the impacts on staff behaviour and performance, which is what this case really demonstrates. And I think, if you were having some of these conversations currently in both the Commonwealth but probably also in other public service settings, you could say, look what happened in Robodebt, and drop a copy of the Royal Commission report and my report on the desk to aid in that conversation, because they are, like both those reports, I try and think of Operation Middlefoot as almost a companion piece to the Royal Commission report, because a lot of what the Royal Commission said about the serious maladministration that went on, I absolutely agree with that. My task was to investigate specific incidences and whether or not they amounted to corrupt conduct under the NACC Act. But really the two pieces can go together. You can also add the APSC Code of Conduct inquiry results into that as well, and it paints a pretty, very evidence-based picture, I guess, about what you could be leading people to get up to if you don't listen to what people have to say about whether or not we should and can really do something as quickly as, what people might think they want to do. And absolutely, like the budget cycle in all governments, it's horrendous, it's tricky, it's always manic, but you still got to do the work and do the proper work, because that's your job as a public servant. And then I think the other challenge for all of us, and I've had this experience myself, is getting your seniors and ministers and their advisors to listen to that and to take it seriously, and for them to have an appropriate response that's not just, I don't want to hear that, just go away and make it happen anyway. Now, interestingly, I think there was some suppositions or inferences led in the Royal Commission that that's what happened. Now, that isn't the evidence that I received in my investigation, that it wasn't a case of this pressure coming down. It was really about how DHS interpreted their writing instructions, which I just found very interesting as I was doing it as a former public servant myself. And, again, I'd say this case is a really good example of the need to keep checking back with your political masters and your public service masters about, like, I think what you want me to do is this, but is it really?
Yeah.
And if I do it, what might happen?
But I think you nailed the word think there, Kylie. So what sometimes worries me about the outcomes of even your report is that a particular type of public sector leader uses some of this to not think and say, until you provide me the exact resources and time I require, I'm going to stonewall. Because that behaviour exists sometimes in the service as well. And there is a requirement. I mean, I think the challenge here is for people to do more thinking and to invest more time in developing that kind of particularly executive thinking, which is, the message isn't you don't have to do a single thing until you are given perfect conditions. The lesson is you need to test the risk and the scale and the vulnerability, and because I just thinking about our many thousands of listeners, many of them are about to get budgets in the next 16 weeks where it'll be like, you need to find X amount and it's got to come down. People like to hang on to their prized kind of bits of work and don't always love that job of trying to figure out what the trade-offs are. And so the inverse of I'll do exactly as I'm told without questioning it is also I'll do absolutely nothing because I don't have perfect conditions. And I think we really need the service to spend more time on the thinking, like as in developing the capacity to ask the first principle questions before they get on with things.
Yeah. And look, there's never perfect conditions in public administration. I mean, I've been in it for a long time now, but I don't think I've ever worked in a government where it's like, here's a bucket of money, it's an endless bucket of money, just keep coming back and tapping the well.
Do your best.
And, whatever you need, you'll get it. There's always, that is absolutely part of your job as an executive, is to be cutting your cloth and giving that advice about, well, what are the risks about if we do it this way, what happens if we do it that way, what happens, as well as that ability as well to keep talking to your ministers about, if you want this, then the hard decision you are going to have to make as a government, because often it's not your decision as the public servant about what to drop and what not to drop.
Exactly.
But having those hard conversations with ministers about, if you want this program, then you're going to have to find the $500 million out of this bucket of money. Which thing do you want us to stop?
I love that you are sort of actively saying this is a helpful tool for public servants who mightn't feel bold. And I really agree with that. I think this, in particular, the Royal Commission report and your report, less the APSC one because they don't do as much storytelling, but the story that you write in the evidence section of this report, I really agree. It's like a thriller as you're reading through, and you're just like, oh my gosh, and then this is, and it paints this very vivid picture of how a series of bad decisions kind of get taken up, including a series of bad assumptions, right? That the minister definitely wanted this and we have to do it. One of the things that you note in your evidence is that DSS find the proposal risible, right? That they laugh at it. They're like, oh my God, it's so bad. It's which I actually took a little bit of comfort for, because when we talked about this in the early episodes, I talked about how when you see someone wearing an ugly dress and you say, oh my God, fabulous ugly dress, it sort of feels like DSS's response was this kind of oh my God, it's so bad we can't say anything. I don't understand, I still don't quite understand the indirectness of their feedback to DHS at this kind of critical moment. Did you get any sense or any insights into kind of what was driving that indirectness? Did they have a sense in their own agency? Why was that so indirect? Did that come up in your investigation?
Yeah, absolutely, because I was very interested in this, because I'm always very interested in those interactions between departments and why people don't be honest with each other, and sometimes too honest with each other as well, and they have these long-standing institutional fights about whatever you bring to the table, we're going to argue about it because we just hate you, and there's a deep hatred between departments. So all that stuff really interests me. But what I'll say about in this job, I think there were a couple of things going on. So there's evidence that the working relationship between DHS and DSS was very tricky. There was confusion and then contests about who was in charge of what. And I've seen this happen a lot when governments split policy and legislation from service delivery.
Yep.
And I think that was part of what was going on. Then what some of the DSS officers said, they were trying to be polite and collegiate. There was a lot of that. Polite and collegiate seems to be the mantra in the Commonwealth Public Service. We must all be polite and collegiate with each other. Well, sometimes we shouldn't be.
Yeah.
So they kept their thoughts to themselves in the moment back in sort of October 2014 when the matter was first brought up, and they walked out going, oh, God, no way. But they basically decided to wait for the more sort of formal process of draft briefs to ministers and cabinet paperwork starting to be drafted as the formal feedback mechanism for them to start to say, hey, there's a few problems here.
Yeah.
But then in that process of who's responsible for finalising those ministerial briefs, again, when you've got sort of joint ministers and joint responsibilities between agencies, it was a bit of a mess. So DHS effectively were holding the pen on a brief to the Minister for Social Services. Very unusual. And everyone commented that it was very unusual. But instead of everyone sitting down and going, this is very unusual, we need to kind of maybe work out you hold the pen for this bit, but we need to hold the pen about the policy and legislation advice. But that isn't what happened. They kind of ceded control on the drafting of the materials to DHS. And then what they were doing is kind of giving very, what's the word for it? Very truncated and then polite sets of concerns were what were being transmitted, even though what I can see in the documents and in the oral evidence I received is there's lots of emails pinging internally in DHS about this is a really bad idea, how do we stop it? Yeah. But that never gets communicated clearly back to DHS, and then DHS kind of pass the words into, this may need policy change, this may need legislative change. when really what should have happened was DSS should have insisted that the form of words that needed to go into both probably that first executive minute, but then also absolutely into the budget proposal and the cabinet paperwork, was that averaging wasn't consistent with the Social Security Act. And if government wanted to do it, they would need to make legislative amendments, which they could do, even though they might be unpopular and they might have gotten blocked by Parliament and whatever. But that piece of advice, like that really critical piece of advice, it never gets clearly spelt out in any of the documentation.
Yeah.
I mean, even inconsistent with the legislation is about as passively public service. I mean, this one I use all the time, which is I have not been pulled over by police since the Robodebt Royal Commission, but I'm dying to say to them, no, it's not against the law. It's inconsistent with the legislation. Like this, even that is passive as all get out. So it's not like that's an aggressive language. And yet they still couldn't kind of, land it, I suppose, or use it.
Yeah, and I think assuming that ministers are going to pick up on some of the nuance of like the polite way that public servants phrase things, I think that's a very dangerous thing to do. I think you've got to put it in really, really clear terms.
Yes.
And then the other thing to say is that the Deputy Secretary in DHS and how she was conducting herself with her DHS staff, some of her behaviour as well when she's communicating with DSS, as well as what she was doing with her own staff, that kind of led to the misleading of DSS. So her behaviour sort of infected how DSS were also behaving.
Yeah.
So I think those are kind of my main insights into what was going on.
It's so interesting. And I think that is I'm so grateful for you coming on to talk about it, because that to me is such a relatable lesson. Like that, just that sense of, I think the right thing to do is be polite. I'll wait for the formal kabuki theatre of like a notes process. Like it's easier to do these things in writing, and never kind of thinking through how that lands in person. I mean, it gives DHS the confidence to kind of skate their way through with their bush lawyering, right? Like there's a whole bunch of kind of things that are enabled by the absence of creating that moment of dissonance. Like they're afraid of the moment of the emotional dissonance of actually this thing isn't okay as it stands, and they step back from that, and so then everyone's like, well, I guess it's okay.
I also don't think that ministers are aware of what they're doing.
Totally.
Sorry, hang on. There was an end to that sentence. That wasn't a full stop. But what I was going to say is when they do MOGs and when they decide structure, it's often for reasons of our stakeholders want environment and energy and mind separate now, stakeholders want them together. It's very rarely what the consequences of some of those things are for the delivery of the work. And the separation of policy and operations, I know that there are people who argue its merits, and that's fine. But it at the very beginning created the opportunity for this to happen, right? Like if you are not responsible for both the policy and the legislation and the humans who will experience the service, then you have already split the idea as to who might be like the problem. Mm-hmm. And so I think I encourage ministers, and I know we've got a few ministerial listeners, to remember that machinery of government and design of what goes where is not just for the outside world. It has huge implications for the inside of how you get your advice and what kind of things happen.
Yeah, it's not just about changing the titles of departments.
Yes.
Which I would say has been my experience of a lot of MOGs.
Yes. 100%. If we go back to that cultural piece though, the role of bullying in enabling that corrupt conduct comes through really, really clearly in your report. And similarly, the APSC found that Catherine Campbell had committed misconduct by creating and allowing a culture that prevented issues from being properly considered, including aggressive and abusive behaviour by a Deputy Secretary. You offer some really interesting insights into the culture, and I really think, culture beats rules almost any day of the week. There's a view that public servants operate by rules and they're very rulesy, and yet my general experience, both as one and now operating in a lot of different public services, is culture beats rules every day. And there was even a kind of choice quote from transcripts in your report about the Deputy Secretary's modus operandi being a shit show, which I think gives me license to now use that in professional work. That's a new swear I can use in professional work. Can you tell us a bit more about what you heard about the culture? I think it's really important.
Yeah, so this is about culture back in 2015, 2017 in DHS.
Yep.
And I really hope it's not like that anymore. And I don't have any evidence to suggest that it is like that, but this is how it was back then. So the evidence I heard was that there was a culture of delivery at all costs, particularly in relation to budget measures. So even when people said, we aren't ready to turn this on, they were told to do it anyway. And that was by the Deputy Secretary. And that's when the 70,000 or so debt letters that went out in late 2016 that really led to the Ombudsman inquiry and the media and the advocacy groups really bringing out the problems with Robodebt out into the open happened. Along the way, I also heard evidence about that Deputy Secretaries in DHS actively undermined each other.
Why?
They screamed at each other in executive meetings and in front of more junior staff. Junior staff were being berated and belittled by that Deputy Secretary, particularly if they ever tried to say there was a problem. That Deputy Secretary, again, at various times seemed to me to be out of her depth about how exactly the scheme was operating. But she was relentless in what she somehow divined was what DHS had been asked to do in 2015. And then by 2017, I think she was in a bit of free fall as the wheels came off Robodebt. And she's calling people, sending emails at all hours, expecting an immediate response at all hours of the day and night. People being expected to work, until 2:00 in the morning, dealing with the Ombudsman inquiry. And then being expected to, turn around and turn up at work again at 6:00 the next morning, and do even more frenetic work defending the scheme.
Yep.
When actually there was a body of evidence building that actually there were some really fundamental issues with both the underpinning policy design as well as like the implementation issues. And so that's all just really awful working conditions, and it's not what you want your senior executives to be behaving like.
Yeah.
And again, I've been a Deputy Secretary in a Victorian government department, and that kind of behaviour would not have been tolerated by my secretaries who I've worked for. And it puzzled me greatly that that was the kind of culture that was allowed to, effectively flourish in DHS.
So we heard evidence from Serena Wilson, the DSS Deputy Secretary, about how long before this she had actually left a department because she was reporting to this DHS Deputy Secretary and she had a very unhappy relationship with her. And I found the moment in the Royal Commission when she was asked whether she'd raised concerns about the behaviour of Melissa Golightly, and she sort of said, look, I did seek some assistance from my peers and from previous colleagues in how to manage, but I didn't take it up in the hierarchy. I didn't pursue bullying claims against her. It's a very fraught area in the Australian public service. I guess, is that kind of comment familiar to you in your current work? Do you still hear people finding it hard to raise concerns around bullying in that way?
Yeah, look, we have done this thing called the Commonwealth Integrity Survey. So we did the first one of those in 2024 and we'll be doing it again later this year. Yeah. And absolutely some of the commentary that we get in that is that people are scared to speak up about senior officers' conduct, and they talk about fear of, career suicide, reprisals, retaliation, and or inaction by their agency heads. And I know that comes up in the APSC People Matter surveys. I've seen it in the IBAC equivalent corruption prevention surveys, and in the equivalent VPS People Matter surveys that happen down here in Victoria. What's interesting to me is how much of that is a kind of myth of untouchability around particularly the Deputy Secretary class that has grown up in both the Commonwealth and probably also the VPS, because I do have examples of, in my own work life, where when people have brought those issues up to the attention of agency heads, there have actually been really, really good appropriate responses where people have been taken into the Secretary's office, spoken to very frankly about what the complaints are about and what the expectations are about either change your behaviour or you're not going to have this job anymore.
Yeah.
And or people have actually been removed from their jobs. So I do have experience of that. Now, I don't have as much experience in the Commonwealth. This is my first Commonwealth position, and I'm intrigued to see, you know, as I sort of stay in the Commonwealth for a little bit longer at least, what I'm going to hear further about, you know, is that conduct still what people are saying is happening in the Commonwealth, or do things like the Robodebt report and the Operation Myrtleford report help change some of that culture and some of that appetite, I guess, for actually saying, well, hang on, like this isn't on, and agency heads as well, like with findings like that against Catherine Campbell, they're on notice now that if they allow that sort of culture to flourish, the APSC is going to probably end their career.
I think this is the second time we've returned to this question of the stories we tell ourselves as public servants, and how when we tell ourselves that we're powerless, or we tell ourselves that this is the way ministers want things to be and so we have to deliver at all costs, or whatever those stories are, that's what's powerful, I think, about this report, is it gives us an opportunity to say, actually, we've got to stop telling ourselves these stories, because actually it's only going to change when we do actually stand up and say. I mean, the one thing I'd say about the senior executives, and I'm sure Danielle will have something to say about this as well, is that, well, I've definitely seen senior executives who behave badly be exited. They're often afforded a level of dignity and secrecy about their exit that doesn't happen for more junior staff. And I think it doesn't help. It does kind of lead to this sense of like a protected class, even if they are exited. So I think that's something we kind of culturally need to.
Yeah, and it's tricky as well, because, you know, certainly in the VPS, it's probably the same in South Australia, definitely in the Commonwealth as well. What I've observed is, you know, career public servants who rise to that deputy secretary level, they've gotten there because they've got very strong relationships sometimes with those agency heads that have employed them. And so there probably is also that perception of, you know, that they're more than just colleagues, that they're friends.
Yes.
And it can be extremely difficult, I guess, to walk into a secretary's office and say, hey, you know, that person that I know you have been working with for 20 years, well, actually, they're, you know, my experience of them is really negative and I would like you to do something about it.
And you shouldn't have to walk into a secretary's office, because if you are 2 layers below, I mean, I think I'm a broken record on this one. I think it's not just whether we have the systems and the culture to do something about senior people, but through this entire process, not a single person ever had an investigation. So an old-fashioned but works quite well, for which there is a very rigorous system, and the bar is very different to your work and to even the APSC, which is there's a complaint, we're going to get someone to investigate it, a report will go to a delegate saying this behaviour was found to be not in keeping with the values of the organisation, or this performance is X.
On the balance of probabilities.
On the balance of whatever. And then there are processes to protect beyond that. So there are then processes after that. There are hundreds of stories in your report and the Royal Commission that 4 years earlier, someone just needed to say something and an investigation would have kind of course corrected. Either the person would have changed, grown and been given another chance with whatever kind of scaffolding was provided, or they might have been exited from the service. But there are, like, it has to be more than going and talking to the secretary, because I think that's a bridge too far for lots of people. And so there's a role here for people in culture and industrial relations for much earlier kind of having a look at performance and behaviour at a senior level and further down. Sorry, I went on a yet again very usual why don't we do IR investigations rant. But in relation to Serena Wilson,
she doesn't play tennis.
3 years of this podcast and I still am doing that. In relation to Serena Wilson, you find that the principal contributing factors are sins of omission. Failure to ensure her staff was satisfied with legality in the lead up to the budget bid, failure to monitor and ensure DHS did what they said they were going to do, failure to be candid with the Ombudsman about her own train of thought and realisation she had been misled by DHS. Overall, you express satisfaction that the Robodebt Royal Commission's recommendations have improved the situations for these preconditions. In relation to kind of improving the rigour of the budget process and requirements around independent legal advice for budget bids and requirements for how departments respond to the Ombudsman, could you tell us a bit more about that? Because fixing the system will always have a longer term effect than some of the individual accountability stories, I think.
Yeah, and absolutely. I just want to note for Ms. Wilson, like, I'm really conscious she had a long career in the APS before what happened in 2017, and she was very well thought of by many people. And I think that's important to acknowledge, and I did that in the report.
You did.
And I've also been very clear in the report that the findings in relation to her about a very specific set of events in 2017 that were about responding to some Ombudsman requests for any legal advice DSS had given DHS about the scheme. And where she went wrong was she firstly didn't provide it when she was asked for it. And then when she was asked a second time, she approved a misleading cover note that went with the 2017 and 2014 advices to really try and explain away the relevance of the 2014 advice. And that's where her errors lay. Now, with respect to the Royal Commission recommendations, there's 56 or something recommendations in the report. They're all great recommendations, I think. But in respect to how they kind of applied to what I was looking at, there's just a couple there that were really about improving the processes and the paperwork that go before Cabinet during the budget process, particularly with respect to getting independent legal advice about proposals before they go to Cabinet, which, absolutely, if that had have happened from the get-go, Robodebt would have sunk without a trace, I think. And then the issue about how departments respond to the Ombudsman, again, what I observed in what happened in 2017 when the Ombudsman inquiry came along was there were absolutely opportunities for Ms. Wilson and DSS to say, hey, DHS have told us a bunch of different things and none of it quite makes sense anymore, and we're very concerned about what's going on. But they didn't do that. They really caved in, I think, to pressure from DHS to sort of back them in that this is lawful on the basis of this idea that they'd been doing averaging as a last resort for decades. Well, that was totally different to what they were doing in Robodebt. Robodebt wasn't averaging as a last resort, even though some people in the compliance area tried to suggest it was. That isn't what was happening. It was averaging up front and issuing debt notices and then putting the onus on citizens to come back and say, I can prove that that's wrong. Completely different operating model to averaging as a last resort. And we talk a lot about that in the report, and it's very technical and detailed and probably puts everyone to sleep when they have to read it. But it is really important to understand that difference between what that averaging as a last resort process was versus what Robodebt was actually about. And look, we looked at both, so we looked at those recommendations, but then I also got advice from Department of Premier and Prime Minister and Cabinet, about the government implementation of them. And I was satisfied with the paperwork that I was given by PMNC that implementation has occurred and that the implementation is, absolutely what the Royal Commission recommended. Not always happens when Royal Commissions happen. Sometimes the way government interprets things, it's not quite what the Royal Commission said. But I was very satisfied with the quality of the work that had happened both in PMNC and some of the other departments around implementation. But I think the challenge now is that what we need to watch for is how well these new processes are then complied with, because often in Cabinet processes people try and take like urgent little shortcuts to get around things, particularly in budget. And also, do they endure? So how long do we hold these lessons about Robodebt from both the Royal Commission report and my work, and make sure that they stick? And I think you guys have talked about stickability in some of your other podcasts. And I think that's a real challenge for the public service, because often we can, we move from one report to the next and go, oh, that was then, this is now.
Except when you read enough of them, the patterns and the conditions of the failures are actually just really, really similar. So the instinct of many a public servant is to go, that was a bad department doing a bad thing, it was a bad time, like to be very specific about it. And yet when you pull back the what was the cause and then kind of map them, there's 10 things that happen every time around, you know, delegating kind of your own integrity and like a whole series of things that you see happen in every single one. And so it's the stickability part, I think, is that we like to consider the stories unique as opposed to the trends, which are not remotely unique.
Yeah, and that idea of like that happened in that agency, I'm in a different agency, it's not going to happen here. Or it's just, I mean, I know with my report, because I only find 2 people engaging in corrupt conduct, not 500, you know, there might be that tendency to go, oh, that's just 2 naughty people, and I'm not like that. But I think, you know, given the right preconditions, I think there, but for many of us go Mr. Withnell and Ms. Wilson.
Oh, 100% agree with that.
Yeah.
You end that chapter and recommendations by noting that you respectfully agree with many of the Royal Commission's recommendations regarding serious maladmin, but that serious maladministration is not necessarily, or frequently not at all, the same as corrupt conduct. I think this is a distinction that lots of people are trying to wrap their heads around. Can you talk us through how corrupt conduct is understood in this context?
Yeah, so this is a bit of a nerd alert.
I think
We've got lots of those. You're in very good company here.
Do you have like a siren that you put into the podcast or something?
Oh my gosh, that is brilliant. Yes, we do now.
A siren that we use to quiet Caroline when the nerd kicks in.
So, and it's Section 8 of the NACC Act, yeah?
Yeah.
That's where all the magic happens around the definition of corrupt conduct for Commonwealth public officials. Now, the challenge, I think, across Australia is that every Anti-Corruption Commission / Integrity Commission has a slightly different definition of what is and isn't corrupt conduct. And so, for example, I came out of 3 years at IBAC where we had a very more restricted definition where you actually had to be able to tie it to a relevant criminal offence and or one of those old common law offences around perverting the course of justice or misconduct in public office. And that created a lot of confusion for people. Now, the NACC, I think the interesting thing about the NACC is because we're the last of the CACs, I think you call them, Danielle.
I do.
Yeah.
Commissions against corruption.
Since we're the last body to come online, I think the benefit we've had is that AGD, when they developed the legislation, was they were able to do a really great interjurisdictional kind of comparison and give us a really good definition of corrupt conduct. And so, you know, in a nutshell, what it basically is about is, you know, adversely affecting a public official's performance of their duties or functions or use of their powers, together with breach of public trust, abuse of office, and misuse of official information. Now, those things can also overlap. So sometimes when we're doing investigations, we can say it can be more than one thing. And with respect to like the findings against Mr. Withnell and Ms. Wilson, it was a finding of that first one of them having adversely they dishonestly performed their functions as public servants, which is a little tricky thing about, there's a thing called Section 8.3a in the NACC Act that basically says 8.1a also applies to you in the performance of your own functions as a public official, which is the thing that has been blowing a few people's minds. But it is in the Act, and I've written a section in the report that kind of explains how those two sections work together. And or alternatively, that it was a breach of public trust, which is the 8.1b lim. Then what you can also look at is the explanatory memorandum, which is a really helpful legislative interpretation tool if you don't understand, like when you just read those sections, like what the hell does that mean?
Yeah, what is a breach of public trust? What is that?
Yes, and we're going to get onto that. But the XMEM tries to give some like plain English guidance around what did the drafters mean, what did the Parliament mean by those terms. And then the other thing that a bunch of people don't seem to quite get is there's also a bunch of applicable case law that then comes in that aids people like me in when I'm interpreting those sections and applying it to people's particular conduct. There is applicable case law that's not necessarily about the NACC Act, but it's about like common law, similar, analogous kind of conduct or statutory schemes and or common law provisions around things like what's misconduct in public office and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's a tricky kind of very multi-layered sort of thing that you have to do when you're unpacking what is corrupt conduct. And then the issue around serious maladministration and the boundaries, like I think absolutely, like unfortunately in the law, often the boundaries are not black and white.
Yeah,
and so there can be, reasonable minds can differ about, is this in the corrupt conduct bucket or is this in the serious maladministration bucket? But I guess the way often I think about it is serious maladministration is often the stuff where there's been no dishonesty, no one's gotten a benefit, like no one's taken a bribe, there's been no deceit. It's just often it's like the stuff-ups, the errors, the mistakes that can get made that are poor, that amount to, breaches of public administration rules and or breaches of the law. So you can actually do something unlawful, which is what happens in Robodebt, and not have engaged in corrupt conduct, but you've absolutely engaged in serious maladministration because you haven't followed your own act.
Yep.
And I could do a whole podcast for you on, corrupt conduct, serious maladministration examples, but we're not going to do that today.
Well, no, but we can come back later. I mean, I think the thing is, if it takes, and this is not a criticism of you at all, these are expectations that I feel that the concepts you are talking about should be understood by senior leaders, full stop, like no matter what their kind of technical background. The challenge is that there are lots and lots of public servants who might be customer service officers. They might have a set of technical skills that make some of these concepts really tricky. And the prevention component for you, I suppose I'm offering you a challenge in some ways, which is explaining the role of the NACC and explaining where those standards sit in a way that all public servants, recognising it's the APS, not all public servants, can kind of grapple with. Look, I suppose it is challenging for non-lawyers to operate in this kind of like, well, what is my rule? What am I supposed to be doing? And I think that there's a real challenge in getting this stuff more digestible for more public servants. And I think out of the nerd zone in some ways, like moving it out of the nerd zone.
Yeah, for sure. And look, that corruption prevention function that I talked about at the start, we are providing a lot of guidance documents on our website that we try to plain English the law into things that people can work with. I think as we do more cases and write more investigation reports, and there's more sort of examples that we can kind of point to and go, if it's this, it's us.
I agree.
But if it's not this, it's not us. I think that will
really
start
helpful.
to help. As well as we are available to go out and talk to agencies, like we love going out and talking to agencies, and we do. Like we've, in the last couple of years, we've done hundreds and hundreds of presentations to different Commonwealth agencies about trying to understand just our jurisdiction and what you need to report to us and what you don't need to report to us. And the thing I always say about when you're thinking about corrupt conduct is think about, as a public official, what are the powers that I exercise? What are the duties that I have? What are the functions I'm performing? Because that's often key to whether or not you can get it up into a corrupt conduct kind of scenario.
Can you the kind of the dishonesty is super helpful. Like I think that really helped me kind of clarify in my mind the difference between some of the things we're talking about in this report versus kind of maladministration. But the other one, the breach of public trust, arguably every single aspect of Robodebt is a breach of public trust in my mind, because the public trusts that government won't issue speculative invoices and shake people down. Right? So can you just talk us through what is a breach of public trust?
Yeah. So there's that plain English kind of understanding. It's a bit like when people say it's corrupt. Yeah. There's a plain English kind of sense of like that stinks. It's corrupt. That stinks. It's a breach of public trust. But it's not like breach of public trust is not the same as letting the public down, doing something the public don't like, making a mistake, or even doing something unlawful.
Yeah.
What's key to it is have you performed a function or a duty, or have you used a power for an improper purpose? Yeah. And then there's a whole bunch of case law that falls out around like how do you define improper purpose, particularly when in some cases like it's some of what you've done is proper and some of what you've done is improper.
Yeah.
And I think that is one of the things that, we need to keep sort of talking about, unpacking, like how do people understand that as a very technical legal term, not as the pub test of, our trust has been broken because government did something that was really wrong.
Yeah.
And you've got to be able, and you can't sort of say, you can't pin corrupt conduct on the government as a whole. It's like our scheme is really about individual accountability, which I know you talk about in the podcast that you've just done. I can't make a finding that everyone in DSS breached public trust
engaged
or anything
in
like
corrupt
that.
conduct. Yeah, it has to be.
Or all of the ministers in the government breached the public trust. It's
the
very
challenge
much
with that is
tied
how
to
does
individuals.
that? I mean, that's the act, and that's what you have to do. There's nothing you can do about that. It's just how well that lines up with how things work. I mean, there are often pieces of work that you, at the end of the day, not sure who owned it, and people move in and out of roles, and I'm sure investigators do an excellent job, and so it's what you have to work with. But it doesn't, for me, I'm like, there are whole things where it would be really hard and unclear to figure out who owned that behaviour or mistake or conduct. And so that's what we struggled with in our last episode, wasn't it, Caroline? Which is, it's not that I have, like, I'm like, yes for individual accountability, and also, oh God, the system, the way the work works doesn't easily line up to individual accountability.
Yeah, and I think that's when some of those overlays around things like the Westminster Conventions come into play about, when ministers are accountable for things that go wrong, and do people still abide by those conventions anymore? I think there's a bit of variability around that. And, there's been debates about, how should that apply in circumstances like Robodebt. And then also I think that conversation you're having in your podcast about like strict liability type sort of arrangements for people like agency heads about, well, if this happens on your watch, you just have to go.
Yeah.
And that's not the scheme that I operate.
No.
But is that the way the system should operate? And that's probably, a conversation for, people who
it's a political conversation.
Design the public service rules.
Yeah.
Right, as opposed to like the job that I do in investigating individuals. And yes, it can be challenging when it's not clear who did what when. But I guess the thing with these Robodebt referrals was they were very specific referrals to me about like on the, Commissioner Holmes was saying like this happened. I think this happened and I think you should check it out as to whether or not it's corrupt conduct or not.
Yep.
Now, sometimes we didn't agree totally on the facts, and then sometimes I couldn't get to corrupt conduct because the evidence wasn't there to get me into one of those limbs of Section 8 of the NACC Act.
Yep.
Even though I might have agreed that course of events happened, but it might not have been corrupt conduct.
I'm very conscious of how much of your time we've had, Commissioner, which I think that's an excellent lead into. There were a lot of disappointed commentators, and I would suspect some of our listeners, in relation to the 4 people you did not find guilty of corrupt conduct, especially Scott Morrison and Catherine Campbell. Would you be interested in explaining a little how you came to those conclusions? As we've been talking about that, how do you land the definition and on a set of circumstances?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing to remember is that the Royal Commission's referrals to the NACC were not that corrupt conduct had occurred. And there seemed to have been some misunderstanding that, Catherine Holmes or Commissioner Holmes had made findings that corrupt conduct had occurred, and really it was just being given to us to kind of tick the box to say, yes, under the NACC Act, that's right. That isn't what the referral said, and now that the sealed chapter's been published, I hope people can kind of read that for themselves, as well as what I tried to do in the report was, we've stepped out exactly what Commissioner Holmes referred to us so that you can see it for yourself, that what she was saying is that it might raise a corruption issue, but that is a question of whether or not corrupt conduct occurred. It's not that corrupt conduct occurred. And that's the case for any investigation that we conduct. There's no foregone conclusions. Very rarely does a matter come across our desk that we go, oh, absolutely, that's, lay down misère. You've got to investigate it. You've got to assemble all the evidence and then apply all the laws. So a couple of things to say about the way that we go about making findings. So findings have to be based on they can be based just on documentary evidence, but we often take oral evidence as well. And as I set out in the report, we did hold a number of private hearings with a large number of witnesses, many of whom had appeared before the Royal Commission. And then we have to apply the relevant case law. And one of the important aspects of applying the relevant case law is that the standard of proof in our matters is the balance of probabilities applying the Briginshaw test. And so for people who haven't heard of the Briginshaw test, what that basically is, it's a legal case that was in about 1948 or something. And basically it sets a standard that says in cases that involve serious allegations like corrupt conduct, the standard of proof is not just the balance of probabilities in its bare form, but it requires a higher degree of satisfaction. And so it's got to be based on clear, cogent and persuasive evidence. And in the case where you're going to make reputational, professional or legal consequential findings, like if you're going to say someone has engaged in corrupt conduct, it's also got to be compelling and credible evidence. So it kind of takes the bar up, not quite to beyond reasonable doubt, like in the criminal jurisdiction, but it gets you pretty close. It gets you very highly, beyond just I'm satisfied that more likely than not this is what happened. You've got to, push yourself up into that like compelling and credible evidence kind of space. So I'm not required to apply the rules of evidence as apply in courts of law, but the other thing I'd say is I can conduct investigations as I think fit. So I also don't have to sort of follow all the rules about how things happen in court. But that doesn't mean I can make findings based on the vibe or subjective opinions or personal thoughts and feelings people might have about how government, politicians, the public service, the system works, or about particular individuals. And I think that has been the difficulty with some of the commentary, is that people hold some very strong opinions about what happened in this matter, but my job is a very forensic task and a very legally complex task. And so for these four, the evidence didn't show that they had engaged in corrupt conduct, and that was a combination of documentary evidence but also that oral evidence, including the 6 referred persons who were all extensively examined by a combination, and a very formidable combination, of the counsel assisting who assisted me in this matter, the Honourable Jeffrey Nettle, KC, who's a former High Court judge who was my chief advisor in this investigation, as well as me. I might come across as very kind and gentle, but in the examination context, I asked the tough questions, including it's a rule of procedural fairness that we have to basically put the allegations, as the Royal Commission kind of put them to us, to those people to answer. And I have to take that evidence into consideration. They give evidence on oath, and unless I've got evidence that contradicts them, that I can say, you're lying to me, which, say, in the case of Mr. Withner, we made some commentary about he didn't quite tell the truth, because we had evidence that we could use to demonstrate that, not just a hunch. That evidence on oath is really, really critical to the way that we go about considering what we will or won't say about people, particularly when we're applying the Briginshaw test. So I appreciate people are disappointed with the findings regarding Mr. Morrison and also Ms. Campbell, but the evidence didn't prove the matters that were referred to me. And the reasons in relation to all 4 of those people are set out in detail in the report, because I wanted to be really, really transparent about the thinking process that we went through. And while they're ultimately my findings, because as the Deputy Commissioner, who's the delegate for the Commissioner, I'm the person who has to sign off that report, and people are free to disagree with them, people should also be aware that, all of everything I wrote was based on advice that I took from Mr. Nettle, so former High Court Justice, assisting me all the way through, senior and junior counsel assisting from the Victorian Bar, both of whom are very experienced criminal prosecutors and investigators, as well as a very capable team of solicitors assisting from the Australian Government solicitors. So, I think there was some commentary about, that I have a naive view about the world of the public service and politics and government, but if I have a naive view, so do all of those people as well, and I don't think that's really a fair take on the task that we undertook. And like I said, it's ultimately a really complex legal task.
Yeah.
And possibly for some people, like those restrictions around the law and the definitions that I have to work within and the processes I have to work within, I'm probably never going to be able to satisfy people that
Well,
what we found was the right thing to find.
I mean, and there's just something as well about, like, to my mind, it's not an exoneration of the behaviour of the people who were found to have not committed conduct. Like, Catherine Campbell has findings made by the APSC in relation to her, you know, frankly deplorable behaviour in relation to kind of overseeing an agency that allowed this to happen. So it's not like there's nothing, but there is something, I think, just you're at the end of the chain, right? Like, and this is the last report to drop. And you can really feel how viscerally people impacted by Robodebt feel let down by not just your report, by the system. Like, I think there's the Rick Morton quote we put up the front of our episode on this. He's like, it feels like I've gone insane watching people who clearly did the wrong thing just kind of move on with their lives. And so, do you have any reflections, I guess, on the imbalance between the precision of the natural justice and the due process you've just described, like this really, like, a technical legal process where you're thinking through what is the sworn evidence, as against, like, just the wild imprecision of the debts that were raised during Robodebt and ruined people's lives? Like, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, and look, full disclosure, you sent me these questions before this podcast, so I have had a chance to think about it, and that question, I have thought about it a lot, and I'll just deal with the first part first. So, like, I've talked a bit about how I came to the conclusions that I did with the 4 that didn't engage in corrupt conduct, but that stuff around natural justice. And again, there's probably not a lot of understanding about what we are required to do. Again, the NACC Act hardwires in how I have to do procedural fairness, as well as there's a whole bunch of common law about natural justice principles and what you have to do anyway that we would have to follow as an administrative body. And I've got to be really careful to be compliant with those rules, because if I don't, what happens to our investigations is we can be taken on judicial review, and that can kick investigations off, like, into the long grass for a very, very long time while courts decide whether or not the processes that we've followed have been fair and legal. The other thing I'd say is, if, God forbid, anyone listening ever ends up before me in an investigation, you will absolutely want that procedural fairness to be applied to you and to anyone that you care about, and it is a really important part of our process. But that's not to detract from the validity of what you're saying about what happened in Robodebt that was totally procedurally unfair. And I'm going to say a few things about that, but one of the things I really want people to remember is that I didn't just agree with the Royal Commission's recommendations. I agreed with her findings about the serious maladministration. Now, I just dropped it in a paragraph at the end, and so probably a lot of people have kind of missed that. Yeah. But absolutely, everything that she said about the serious maladministration, I agree with that, and I've said that in the report.
Yeah.
Which is why I also talk about these things as being a companion piece. It's not like I'm saying that what she said was totally wrong. There are some things that, where we've come to a different landing on specific events because of what the evidence before me shows, that that Royal Commission didn't have the time to get into that level of forensic detail that I've had to go through with the 6 individuals. But I absolutely appreciate the dismay and anger about what happened in Robodebt and its aftermath. Robodebt, in my view, was extremely poorly conceived, and it shouldn't have made it into that first executive minute. And in January 2015, and it absolutely shouldn't have gotten up through the budget process. And the Royal Commission, and also probably the class action, have described that as a catastrophic systemic failure of public administration, and I agree. And then there were so many missed opportunities along the way for the government to realise what they were doing wasn't the right way to calculate debts or to fix errors that were being brought to their attention and to stop the serious damage that was being done to individuals. There were, a number of people speaking up that should have been listened to, and things could have been turned out very, very differently. And that failure to listen and respond responsibly to criticism contributed to the damage done in some cases. And I think the Robodebt case shows the very appalling things that can happen when a government's tendencies are to hunker down, deflect, defend and attack. And I think that's one of the key lessons that, this work all should absolutely sort of land with all of us. And I'm really conscious that all these post-event legal proceedings, inquiries, investigations, they can't fully repair that damage.
Yep.
And I'm really conscious that there are people out there who lost children as part of what happened in Robodebt, and there is no legally available process or remedy or compensation that is ever going to make up for losing a child. And a lot of wrong things happened along the way, but not all of that can be characterised as corrupt conduct. And that's the limitation in the Commission's part in this whole sorry saga, which has absolutely frustrated some people. And I hear that and I respect it and I empathise deeply with it. And it's probably of no comfort to people like Mr. Morton or some of the other people who've spoken up about how they feel about the report. But the findings against Mr. Withnell and Ms. Wilson are serious. Mr. Withnell was an SES 2 in the Commonwealth Public Service. That's a very high-level senior official. Ms. Wilson was an SES 3. And if they hadn't retired already, I could have, because I have powers under the NACC Act, to make recommendations to the APSC about what should have happened with their employment, and you can imagine what I might have said. The report notes that also that if there had been sufficient admissible evidence, I would have referred their conduct to the CDPP for them to consider whether to prosecute them. And that was one of the key reasons why we didn't hold public hearings in this matter, because we were trying to protect the prospect of bringing a prosecution if we could get there. But because it was only when Mr. Withnell and Ms. Wilson made a number of admissions in the private hearing setting that are coercive hearings where you have to answer our questions, and there were many questions, they were really key to us being able to make the findings of serious corrupt conduct that we were able to, but they're inadmissible in a prosecution. And that's, again, hardwired in the Act, as well as it's a basic principle around all the anti-integrity commissions that if you confess to us, it can't be used against you in a criminal prosecution. And again, I appreciate that is probably very disappointing to some people, because I know some people really wanted prosecutions to be part of what happened in this matter. But that's where we ended up in this matter in terms of like the evidence and what was legally available to us.
Thank you so much for your candour there, Commissioner. That's and for coming on the podcast. I think these things can feel very mysterious, and not everyone has the time and is able to kind of get through the line by line. And hopefully, this is a different way for people to start to hear what it is you were able to do, what it is you did, but also what it is that you learnt from that kind of conditions and preconditions and prevention. Because, I mean, from our perspective, I think I don't like to speak for Carolina Ellison, but what we saw in Robodebt should change the nature of how we are a public servant. And you are the last regulatory spokesperson on what that looks like in this chain of events. So we are very, very grateful for your time. Now, usually our mugs are very sought after around the country in public sector offices, and we usually gift a mug to our interviewees, but, you know, we were concerned about needing legal advice and probity.
Yeah, I don't take gifts.
So can the kitchen at the NACC take another mug? If not, we will give one.
Great.
Right, excellent.
Yes, and before anyone asks a question about this at Senate estimates, what will happen is it will be declared by me in my next quarterly gift benefits and hospitality declaration, and absolutely it will go to the Melbourne office where I'm based, where many, many cups of tea will be drunk in good public service fashion. The other thing I just wanted to say is just picking up that last point, Danielle, about the lessons learned and the concerns that you expressed in your podcast this week about, you know, have people really sort of taken this on board is a couple of things. So one is, like I said, we are very happy to come out and talk, and I'm very happy personally to come out and talk specifically about this matter to any of your listeners who want to hear more. And so please just get in contact with me if you do. But the other thing to say is the Commission will shortly be releasing some guidance material that kind of builds off the lessons learned from Robodebt Royal Commission findings, as well as this report, that is really around like how do we ensure that we don't make the mistakes that were made in Robodebt, and that's going to be up on our website probably around the same time that this goes to air. And so hopefully I can pop the little link to that into your show notes.
Perfect.
And again, if people want us to come out and talk more about like what do you mean when you say we should do this or we should do that, we absolutely want to get out and teach people how to be not corrupt, as well as doing the investigative work that we also do.
That's fantastic.
Oh, what a fantastic offer. There you go, listeners. We don't normally have a link to a service in our show notes. So, Commissioner, I would also, my other one would be when you declare it, the actual financial value of the mug is perilously low and out of whack with the it's like the sentimental value when you get the ring from Nana when she passes and then you're 22 and you take it to the gold shop and they're like $4 and you're like, oh, okay.
It's a good $7, Danielle.
It's not worth quite what, but it will all be recorded as a...
I'll declare it anyway, Danielle.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time, Commissioner. Till next time.
Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.